Today, we're going to finish up our lesson on immigration and migrants by answering a very important question about how and why migrants face challenges when they move from place to place. The images on the front slide, you can tell the diversity and the complexity of information that we're going to go through today. And it's just not one part of the world. This happens all over the world. So we will focus on just a few parts that are close to the United States, look at our immigration to give you an idea about what the policies are and so on. And then after we take this note session, we'll go around the world and look at other policies from around the world of how other countries deal with this very important question that pretty much all governments have to answer at some point. First thing we're going to talk about today is government immigration policies. Now, most countries around the world have them. Most countries around the world do definitely have them. And most countries' immigration policies are definitely influenced by certain factors. One of those factors is public opinion. Public opinion. Obviously, the citizens definitely have an opinion whether they are for or against the admission of migrants into a country. Another factor that influences these policies are the economic problems or the economic issues. How newcomers to a local economy will positively or negatively impact the economy. Another factor is resources, all right? Does a country have the ability to accommodate newcomers as far as resources are concerned and so on? And then there's an international relations factor that comes into play, and this is more of a humanitarian outlook. It's the perception and the responsibility of the family of nations in the world to allow for people to be admitted into their countries to improve their lives and so on. That's what's meant by international relations. Now, who's in charge of this? Well, the United Nations classifies countries as to where they stand as far as their immigration policies are concerned. And there's basically four types of immigration policies. Number one, the first one is to maintain, all right? That means the United Nations feels that your country is doing a good job and you need to maintain the current level of immigration. Now, the next type of immigration policy, the United Nations encourages countries to increase the level of their policy, to increase and look at this a little bit closer because they're not exactly doing a great job and so on. The next one, obviously, is to reduce the level, okay? Too much immigration, too many immigration policies. The freedom to let people into the countries is affecting the country as a whole, and the United Nations realizes this. And then some countries around the world basically have no policies whatsoever, according to immigration. Now, as you look at this diagram, you can see the dark green areas are countries that the United Nations encourages more immigration. It's as if that these countries have shut down their borders and so on for reasons, but the United Nations feels that they can open their borders a little bit and encourage more immigration. The majority of the countries in the world, it looks like, maintain a current level, are doing a good job with it and so on in the eyes of the United Nations. Some need to reduce, and you can see in orange on the map those countries around the world that need to do that. And then just a few countries in Africa have absolutely no intervention or no policy when it comes to the immigration policy. Now, this diagram that's on the slide does a real good job of showing you in 2019, mid-year 2019, the closest that we can have. You can see international migrants around the world, and you can see the leaders there. You can see the by continent where they're going and so on, okay? And that gives you a good idea and a good visual of the amount of people that we're talking about here when we deal with international immigration. Now, the next thing we're going to talk about is unauthorized immigration. And sometimes, and I might tell you this later in the slide, that unauthorized immigration, sometimes that might be politically incorrect these days. Some prefer that the immigration is called undocumented. Basically, that's part of the definition here of unauthorized or undocumented immigration. It's when people enter a country without proper documents. Now, in the United States, you can see the figure of where we were in 1990 and where we stand now, all right? And there's a couple reasons for that. So we'll focus on the U.S. here because it's our home country, and obviously we're one of the world leaders in immigration, and we have a huge number of migrants that live in our country for a very long time. So in 2015, there were 11 million unauthorized immigrants, and obviously that's just a ballpark figure from the Pew Hispanic Center, where we get most of our information from. That was an estimate, okay? You can see that on the chart in 2008, that took a little dip in between 2005 and 2010. That's when our country went through a little recession, actually a big recession that many of you lived through and your parents lived through and so on. Okay, so there's definitely a reason for that. Now, as far as the other information and as far as the other facts, as far as unauthorized immigration in the United States, one thing that we need to know, that the origin country, the source where most immigrants come from, is Mexico. All right, somewhere around 6 million of the 11 million, all right, come from Mexico, and the others are basically divided between the Latin American world. Okay, so there's a lot there. The most common destinations here in the United States are California and Texas. About 2.4 million undocumented immigrants lived in California, and around 1.7 to 2 million lived in Texas. And that's basically where we're at. About 1 million children. The children are here while living in the United States, giving birth to about 4.5 million babies. And one thing that you need to know is that when a child is born here in the United States, that child becomes an American citizen. All right, and that's intriguing to people, and that is definitely a pull factor for folks coming to the United States. About 61% in 2013, 61% of undocumented immigrants had been here for 10 plus years. About 23% for about 5 to 9 years, and about 16% were here less than 5 years. Okay, so there are people that have been living here for a very long time that have been unauthorized or undocumented. Now, as far as the labor force is concerned, about 8 million of these 11 million were employed, all right? And that's a pull factor. That's a huge pull factor for people coming into the United States illegally, unauthorized, undocumented, and that's jobs, okay? They had definitely taken jobs in construction, definitely taken jobs in hospitality, and so on, but you didn't see very many of these people in education, healthcare, finance, and things like that. This map does, and this chart map does a real good job of showing you the states with the most. I mentioned California and Texas. Their borders are open. It's the largest borders that we have, which we'll talk about later in this lesson. And then you can look at the states around. You can see Florida's number there and so on of unauthorized, or as we call, undocumented immigrants. Now, the next thing in the third part of class we're going to talk about is quotas. All right, quotas. Quota is a word that you've heard of before. You probably know the definition for it. A quota is something that the United States, for example, and countries use to regulate migration, to regulate the numbers, okay? So it's a law stating the maximum number of immigrants that a country can take, basically, okay? Up until the 20th century, the United States did not even have quotas, okay? Since that, there's been an Emergency Quota Act that was passed in 1921, which basically outlines a framework for the number of immigrants that the United States can take in. Now, the Emergency Quota Act restricted the number of immigrants admitted from any country annually to about 3%. All right, 3% of the number of residents from the same country living in the United States in 1910, okay? So they look at the amount of immigrants that were here from a country, and then they put a limit on that as far as the number of immigrants that are from that country living in the United States at this point. They take 3% of that, and that's the maximum number of immigrants that the United States can take in annually, okay? Now, the Emergency Quota Act was a result, basically, of something called the Dillingham Commission. The Dillingham Commission that was created in 1907 that basically started to investigate the effects of immigration. Okay, so we didn't have quotas. We had open borders, all right? And during this time period in the early 1900s, somebody took a step back and said, hey, we need to look and see at how this is affecting our country, economically, the resources, and all those factors that influence immigration and so on. Now, most Americans during this time opposed it. They opposed, during this time, immigration. Immigrants had a real tough life when they came over here from the start. You can tell there's horror stories about the gangs of New York and so on. It was a popular movie that came out years ago, but it was actually based on a true story of how these people had to live, which they had to resort to crime. and they were taking American jobs. So Americans were definitely opposed to the early immigrants that were coming here. Now, over the years, there have been changes to quotas, okay? So we're talking about, from 1820, you can see the number of immigrants from our lesson 1, section 1, the same chart. You can see where we're talking about here up until 1910, and then you can see a spike in 1910 of immigrants coming here, causing problems and causing the Americans to have an opinion about this. Now, over the years, the quota system has changed, okay? So in 1924, we knocked down the 3% from a total country to 2% from a country, okay? To try and knock down those numbers a little bit. In 1965, we went hemisphere, all right? So we put quotas on the amount of immigrants that came from the Western Hemisphere and the amount that came from the Eastern Hemisphere. It didn't focus on the individual countries too much. In 1978, we did a global quota, all right? A global quota of 290,000 was set, including a maximum of 20,000 per country, okay? So that's the maximum number of immigrants that we would take in 1978. And the last global quota was in 1990, where that quota moved from 290,000. 12 years later, it moved to 700,000, okay? So once again, a quota is a law establishing the maximum limit on the number of people who can immigrate into a country, okay? And these ideas and these examples are from the United States, just to give you an idea specifically how our country deals with immigration. Now, the next thing we're going to talk about in the fourth part of class is something called skill and family-based migration. And, over the years, and especially you guys living in a time now where social media is apparent and you can read these stories all the time, obviously this has been a very, very sore subject in the United States. And it changes from the ideas and the perception that a presidents give, all right? So presidents lead the charge on immigration usually, and in different states here in the United States, especially the southern border states to Mexico, have extreme opinions, and we'll focus on those here as we go. Now, basically, skill and family-based migration has to do with how Congress has set preferences as far as exceeding quotas and so on. So congressional preference is set because of the number of applicants, all right? You have to have this cap, and Congress has a lot of input into, because they get so many applicants. That's the problem, okay? Now, let's talk about a couple of these preferences. So the first one is family reunification, okay? About 3/4 of immigrants are admitted into the United States to reunify with their family members that are already here, okay? Spouses, unmarried children of people that are living here already in the United States make up the majority of the 3/4 of the immigrants, okay? So we admit folks into our country to reunify with family members and so on, okay? The next one, or the next congressional preference, those that we prefer to admit into our country are skilled workers, all right? Talented people receive most of the remainder of quotas. And we'll go away from the United States to talk about this because some countries around the world have skilled worker programs, immigration skilled worker policies and programs. Canada has an extensive program. Australia has an extensive program where they advertise that we need skilled migrants, not just workers in the field, but we're talking about doctors, we're talking about lawyers, we're talking about people that have skill, and you can see the images there of the type of people that they want. All right, so there are definitely policies in some countries that definitely need skilled workers, and we'll talk about how some places are in the demographic transition stage 4 and stage 5, where their job force is down, so they are definitely relying on immigration and these skilled migrants to come and help them out. Now, to go along with this, there's a term called diversity lottery, which makes up the remainder, the small remainder of people that places let into their countries and so on. Basically, there are a small number of immigrants that are admitted into countries by lottery. And the diversity lottery is very simple to understand. So they look at people coming from places that historically have not had a lot of that where we have not admitted a lot of these folks from certain countries, okay? And if that number is very small, for example, if you look at the 15 countries in the diversity lottery in the United States here in 2010, the countries of like Ethiopia, Egypt, Uzbekistan, Nigeria, historically have not sent or we have not admitted a lot of migrants from these types of countries. So the diversity lottery allows for us to look at where people come from. And if that percentage is very low recently in our recent history as far as the immigration from these countries, we would admit those folks because it's a very small percentage of these people coming from their countries. Now, there's a word that's associated with this, and it's called the brain drain. The brain drain. This is large scale, huge amounts of people that emigrate, go away from their countries to other countries to fill these skilled positions, okay? What happens then, the countries of origin from which they immigrated from are left with shortages of these skilled professionals, and this can be a problem, okay? So you have big countries with great economies like Australia and Canada and the United States and places like this that are basically draining other countries of their brains, all right, of their very skilled people and talented people, and that can be a problem, and that's definitely an effect of skill-based migration, okay? And that's where we're at. Now, we're going to look at the United States and Mexico border because in our lessons, in our last lessons here on immigration, obviously there have been issues for a very long time over this. And living in the year 2020, you folks have lived in a time where this has been brought to the forefront politically and so on, okay? So the United States-Mexico border is what we're going to focus on here for a little bit and look at the issues that we have with immigration here with Mexico. So the United States and Mexico border is almost 2,000 miles long, almost 2,000 miles long. And there are barriers that cover about one quarter barriers, iron barriers that we'll look at here in a second. This barrier is basically responsible, or who is responsible for keeping official maps and taking care of this is the United States-Mexican International Boundary and Water Commission, all right? This is the commission, this is the organization that's responsible for keeping maps based on 19th century treaties, all right? So this is based on information from the 19th century, and it really hasn't changed too much since then, okay? So once again, this commission keeps maps of the border, where these barriers are, and once again, it hasn't been updated since the 19th century too much, okay? And that's what we have to go on as far as the border is concerned. Now, along the United States and Mexican border, there are monuments and there are markers, okay? So there's 276 6-foot-tall monuments that mark the border, okay? Sometimes those monuments have a fence between them in really remote and desolate areas along the United States and Mexican border, which basically can be in the middle of a desert, all right? There's obviously no barriers between these. Now, there's also 440 15-foot-tall markers that were put in by the 1970s and so on, okay? So in some of these areas, it's really difficult to even in remote areas, it's even difficult to locate the border, okay? So it is an interesting story to talk about. Now, this map does a really good job of showing you, different fences and vehicle fences along the border from Brownsville, Texas, all the way to Tijuana in Mexico and California there, down by San Diego in the southern part of California, okay? You can see that the majority of that border, there to the eastern part of the border from El Paso east, doesn't even have a fence, all right? It does not have a fence, okay? And then you can see from El Paso to Tijuana, now there's vehicle fences, there's pedestrian fences, and so on in those areas. And you can also see federal and state protected land, all right? Which the federal and the state, our governments have done this to protect that land to ensure that they can do what they want on that land as far as keeping immigrants out, is basically what they're trying to tell us. Now, one thing that we have are border disputes, and Americans are basically and have always pretty much been divided over this topic, okay? Our recent president, President Trump, ran part of his platform was talking about building the wall, and you guys lived through this when you were in middle school and so on. So some presidents and some leaders pay more attention to this than others, but it's definitely a topic that forever Americans have been divided on. Now, what are the reasons why there has been this division of Americans, okay? And let's answer that question, why? Why have Americans always been divided over border disputes, especially the border between Mexico and the United States, okay? Well, one thing is security, and it has to do with money, all right? Americans feel like, some feel like we give way too much money for patrols and so on. We give too much money putting out these cameras that are state-of-the-art with the best technology that we have these days, cameras, to enforce keeping people in, keeping people out, and so on, okay? So one of the big questions and one of the big arguments are the majority definitely oppose spending money to build more fences, to build this wall, okay? And that comes out of our tax money and so on. So that's one reason why Americans are divided over this topic. Now, the workplace, all right? Unauthorized and undocumented workers take jobs, all right? They take jobs. So there are work-related programs that we need to make this stuff legal, okay? Some oppose raids on workplaces and attempt to round people up, okay? So the workplace can definitely be a problem, and it's something that Americans definitely do not agree on, okay? As far as the workplace is concerned, jobs, raiding these job places to try to take in these undocumented immigrants and so on. Some folks think that this could be definitely a civil rights issue, okay? Law enforcement, they basically can walk up to a person and stop them and verify the legal status. If it shows that these folks are undocumented, they can deport them on the spot, okay? So this has been a real big issue, and it's something that Americans are definitely divided on, that, it's a civil rights issue that some people obviously forever in this country have argued about, okay? You can see all these, you can Google any of these images, and you can see this lady, I'm Mexican and I am not running, okay? So there's a lot of stuff that goes on here, and it's something that's going to go on for a very long time. Basically the enforcement of this is something that, is argued about and disputed about. It's these local initiatives, who basically makes these laws. Does the federal government have the right to make a law about immigration on the border of Arizona? You've seen in the news over the last 4 years the fight between our federal government and local governors and states that want to close borders. Some are open to it. So basically, you're always going to have division. You're always going to have people that want different things according to how it works, all right? And that's basically how it is. The residents that live in these states, are very outspoken. Some have family in Mexico that want them to immigrate to the United States and be allowed to join their families, like we talked about in the reunification of families. Others that live and want stronger enforcement of immigration laws, okay? And that's something that's going to be talked about for a long time. The border crossings are interesting to talk about because there's diversity in the types of borders that are crossed along the border of the United States and Mexico. I personally have been down we actually in college, one of the teams that we played was the University of Texas Pan American, and was down on the border of Texas and Mexico. It was right in Brownsville, down there in McAllen, Texas, and I actually got to go across the Hidalgo and Reynosa border crossing, and it was interesting. I've heard about it my whole life, and to go across and see what it's like on the other side, the process that you go through. It's kind of cool to go through the border crossings here along the border. There are 67 border crossings, official border crossings. Some are pedestrian crossings, some are vehicle crossings. Pedestrian crossings are ones where you walk across, and then obviously the vehicle ones are the bigger ones where vehicles can cross into. And there's a lot of diversity. Now, here's the Tijuana border. All right, this is the border crossing between San Diego and Tijuana. It's one of the largest, okay? And you can see that the traffic jams, the lines to get in and out of the United States to Mexico are very long, and it's a very, very traveled border crossing. Now, there's one, and you can see it on a map here that I'll show you in a second, called Nuevo Progreso, where there's articles where people that live in the American side simply just walk across to breakfast in Mexico whenever they want. It's a very laid-back border crossing and so on, and many Americans simply walk back and forth, on a daily basis to explore and so on. Sasage border crossing there in Sasage, Mexico, which is in the central part pretty much of that, you can see that here's a border crossing. It's in the middle of a desert, okay? It's not traveled at all, and that's basically how that's going to work. Now, Europe immigration issues, all right? Let's finish up by talking about other places around the world. Obviously, we talked about the United States here because it's near and dear to our heart, and we know a lot about this stuff. But we want to finish the lesson today by talking about, immigrations around the world, and definitely European immigration issues that they have. Now, one problem in Europe today with immigration is that the numbers are increasing, and I say that it's too easy, okay? Europe's immigration policies across the board have been pretty lenient as the years have gone along, and it's really easy for people to move into these countries. The borders are lax, and it's very easy for folks to move into, like I said, the countries of Europe. Now, one thing that some countries have gone to is a program called guest workers, okay? Europe and most European countries recently are in stage 4 or stage 5 of the demographic transition. It's a declining population. Immigrants are taking a lower status. They're taking low-skill jobs that basically local residents did not want to take and do not want to do, okay? So there is a need for these what we call guest worker programs, all right? An example of some of these jobs are like driving buses, collecting garbage, public works jobs, like repairing streets and signs and things like that, washing dishes, things like that people do not want. European countries are encouraging these programs and these people. Now, Germany, for example, has a very extensive, and other wealthy countries in Europe have a very extensive guest worker program, all right? People from poorer countries can come in. They can temporarily obtain jobs. They're protected by laws within Germany. For example, minimum wage laws are protected. Labor unions, they can join and so on, and other programs that are there. Now, the 1960s and the 1970s, these guest worker programs operated during this time. Germany still has it, for example, but mostly all countries in Europe had this. It gives us back an idea, which we talked about already, called circular migration, which is a temporary movement of a migrant worker between their home and the country where they seek employment. Okay? Now, guest workers are expected to return back to their country once their work is done. Okay? Some stay, some do not stay, all right? Which is proving another problem, which is why the numbers of these immigration numbers in Europe are increasing. Okay? Now, many have stayed, okay, like I said, and many have stayed instead of going home for many generations, which means there are children, there are grandchildren, there are great-grandchildren that are being born through this guest worker program, okay? And if you take a second and look at this political cartoon, you'll be able to see, what this is all about and so on, and that's how it works. Now, this is a win-win, in most cases for the host and basically the country of origin. As far as the host is concerned, you have people taking jobs that others will not. You have a labor force number is increasing by these guest workers. The country of origin, these are not skilled workers that are leaving the country. It's not part of the whole brain drain concept. This actually helps countries of origin because it frees up more jobs for people living within these host countries and so on. This diagram shows you what a guest worker is and so on. And like I said, some can be skilled, but most of the time it's not. Most of the time these guest workers are taking jobs that pretty much nobody else wants. Okay? Well, let's figure out, let's finish with the attitudes that Europeans have toward immigrants. And it's very similar to the Americans' opposition to immigrants early on in the 1900s when there was a huge influx of immigrants that came, like we've talked about already in prior lessons, from Germany, from Scotland, from Ireland, and so on. Most of the people are okay with this. It's the political parties that get into play and are usually really against these practices all over Europe. Now, let's answer the question, why? Why are these folks so against the concept of people coming into their country and so on? Well, most political parties in Europe argue that these folks bring a lot of crime. They basically, instead of helping, they add to the unemployment. And there's high welfare costs that come into play regarding these immigrants that come into these countries to work and so on. Okay, so most political parties are against this. Now, Europeans are asking questions about, do we restrict immigration or do we welcome it? There's actually a debate there in your book which shows the reasons why Europeans want to restrict immigration and the reasons why some want to welcome. Now, one big problem and one reason why Europeans are against these practices and against these, the immigration, basically immigrants coming into their country overall, is because of cultural traditions are at risk, okay? And some people feel like immigrants are a threat to present host countries because they have different religions, they have different languages, they have different food, they have cultural habits that are different. And basically, unfortunately, some folks, especially people within these political parties, feel like these immigrants are a threat to hundreds and hundreds of years of cultural traditions in these host countries, okay? So if you want to stop for a second and pause this and look at the reasons why European countries want to restrict immigration and why they are welcoming it, go ahead and pause for a second and read those and see where and why these people are having a problem. Now, recent trends start towards 2015, and there's been a lot of hostility towards immigrants over the last 20 years in Europe, especially the refugees from Asia, okay? So you can see that coming into Europe, you can see where these folks are mostly coming from, all right? And there's been a huge uptick in opposition to immigration in Europe for certain reasons. Now, Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan have been in disarray. Many of them have come over land and moved into Europe, but a lot of them have come via boat via the Mediterranean Sea. Now, one problem that is happening here in one example of opposition has to do with religion. And it gets a little racist here a little bit because these are folks from Muslim countries that are coming into Christian territories, and it's happening at a bad time. Now, just so happens that here's a diagram of terrorism attacks, and Europeans are racially profiling these folks and tying these Muslims into being Muslim extremists or terrorists, okay? But nonetheless, there's a lot of opposition since 2015 because of the number of terrorist attacks that have happened in Western Europe. And this chart shows you the number of deaths at the hands of terrorism, okay? So whether you think it's fair or not, this is the appeal. This is what political parties are and the way that they're thinking. And it's kind of like a cop-out and of saying, no, all right, we're not letting these people in based on their religion, and they're basically grouping these folks into, Muslim extremists and so on, and using it as a cop-out, to keep these people out of their countries, okay? Here's an interesting, image that I found that said, we want to go to our father in Germany. It's a mother and her son that wants to be reunited with that. However, lately, European immigration policies are opposing immigrants from these different places. That's where we'll end for the day.